So I'll start off. My name is Penelope Siebert. I'm a senior lecturer here at Nottingham Trent University, but I'm not sure how much of my Guyanese accent is left, but I did grow up in Guyana and spent my holidays with my grandparents in the Berbice region. And so a bit of context, I met Paulette, it's becoming many years ago, with our shared interest in looking at, first of all, non-communicable diseases, but focusing on suicide, primarily based on Paulette's work around suicide and murder-suicide. So, and that gave us a point to start our relationship and to build it over the years. And so that's where I'm at. So a lot of my suicide work tends to be linked with Paulette and linked to Guyana and exploring, trying to look at it from a different perspective. I've recently connected up with a group in Canada called Critical Suicide Network Group. I don't know if Prudence, you've heard of them, and they with Professor Jennifer White, and they're exploring suicide from alternative perspectives and wanting to situate some of suicide research within the non-pathological thinking in terms of pathologies and medical thinking, because we feel that there is room in this arena for different ways of exploring suicide and suicide ideation. So I'll pass over to Paulette, and we've got an hour and a bit, so there's time for conversation and people to join in. So I'll be really grateful if people have questions, during the presentation. Let's make this more a conversation than just a presentation. I'll pass over to Paulette.
Thank you, Penny. Good morning, colleagues all. We are pleased to share with you the work that we have done over time. It's not necessarily good work in terms of wanting to do suicide, but I think our work focuses on understanding why, understanding from the basic level, from that individual level, and hence my interest in why people would want to harm themselves or their partners, and what is it, because we have gone through in Guyana a spate of almost every day, seeing in the newspapers or seeing somewhere some report being made on suicide, and that piqued my interest. And so when Penny and I teamed up a while back, we had this common interest of seeking to find out why. And at the time when we were talking, it was more around the males, because what we found are more female attempters, but male suicide was often deliberate and completed. And then there was the whole notion of murder-suicide. And I did some work there, and there is so much more to be done, Penny, to build on that paper that was started. A lot has evolved, and what we are finding, because there was a while back when the thinking was that suicide happened in certain enclaves with certain sets of people, with certain groups of people, and now we are finding that professionals and others and so many others are, wanting to harm themselves and seem not to be happy with living. And what is causing it in a country like Guyana with a small population where we have almost everything, what is causing this? And so this work that we have started to do today, that we are presenting and sharing with you, is a piece of work where we sought to get into the thinking of a male who sought to harm himself and harm his partner. And he helped us to understand what what contributed to him being in that place. And that's where we want to have this conversation with you, and for you to also give us your feedback. Tell us what your own thoughts are. Penny?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start the presentation. And as I said, please, we're happy for you to ask questions and, indicate. So, we don't have to wait right till the end. If you have a thought while we're doing this, just say, oh, can I ask a question? Or, put it in the chat, and then we can take it from there. So, good. So again, we all know the context, and I like to put this up because I think it just reminds us about the population size of Guyana. It's also what I discovered when I did a little search, that it is considered one of the least populated countries in the world. Now, one of the other areas that Paulette and I over time, why is it running ahead? Over time, would like to look at is, some of these the influences of, for me around the colonizations by the Dutch and the British, what, is that another area that we could be looking at? Just talking a little bit about, bringing the attention to, where people have come from and how they came to Guyana and what they were doing. And they kind of what we call that possibility of the link between past traumas linked to colonialism is something to start to think about. Now we have an added development in the country's histories around the fact that we're now seen as becoming one of the richest countries in the Southern Hemisphere after being one of the poorest. And, what are the implications for that? And again, we're not sure, and that's something to think about. And there's a rule, there's a possibility of exploring this in a different way, and maybe longitudinal studies to kind of look at the impact of this over time.
Could I ask a question? Can I ask a question? So how is it becoming one of the richest?
Because of the oil.
Because the oil. Okay.
Yeah, and it's, it's there when you look at there was an article in the Financial Times in the UK, and interesting, what you can see, what you start to see is the change in the dynamics in international relationships between Guyana and, what I call the more developed countries. And, the concern in a way that, there is the possibility of what I call another form of colonization and taking of resources and then not benefiting the local populations. So what we're seeing, as we can now say, for things like, you can tell that Guyana's status in the world has changed. One, we're now having direct flights from BA to Guyana. But the biggest change is usually for me is when you see the diplomatic changes in things like, we now suddenly we can have visas. There is visas now to the UK to visit, which has never been something in the, it has been something that hasn't happened for a long time. So suddenly there's a change, which to me signals that there's more interest from international organizations, and not wanting to make it too political, but these are some of the issues that we got to think about, because part of looking at suicide from what I call a critical suicidology lens is bringing in some of the wider political, social, cultural aspects of life and living in a country like Guyana that has this colonial past, and the concerns that and the divisions that this new status that Guyana is having as an international oil powerhouse can have on the local population. And again, as it was pointed out in the keynote speech, that the rate of suicide, it was third, and I noticed in the recent World Health report that it's gone back to second. So again, it's still in that top 5, and it's been like that from I think 2016 when I first started to really focus on rates around suicide in Guyana. And one of the things I think, and again, this is work that Paulette had done in 2016. So again, there is, as Paulette was saying, that there is, there's more work to be done. Again, we don't really know. And there is one of the things we did want to explore is looking at some of the data to really unpick the incidence of suicide, murder-suicide in Guyana, to see if this is something that is growing or underreported. And I know you were doing some work on this, Paulette, by looking at the police data. And I'm not sure what happened with that project, or if that's something else that we'd like to take forward, how we do that. So these are the kind of areas that would be of interest going forward. So background, and I'll say a little bit, and then I'll let Paulette talk through this, because in a way, Paulette started this journey with this paper, and then invited me to look at the data and then look at the paper and see how we could reshape it from the original narrative that she'd collected from someone. But the starting point really about this was this issue around murder-suicide, building on Paulette's work. And then and then looking at this relationship between intimate partner violence. And then because of Paulette's background as a social worker and then working in social work, was this link between the exploring this idea around female sexual abuse or abuse of young people, particularly of males. So we wanted to look at, with the nature of, what happens to young adolescents. We focused mainly on early adolescent male in Guyana, and trying to explore if this had some sort of impact on how people's thoughts, their mental health, their emotional well-being in later adulthood, particularly around suicide ideation and thoughts of murder, suicide, killing their partner for whatever reason. So that's sort of the background. And the literature is really interesting on this, around this area as well, particularly around the views that females are not, not normally seen as the perpetrators of sexual violence against young men or sexual abuse. And then we have to be careful in unpicking it, because when you have an early adolescent a man, as you can see as we talk about this case, they're not gray areas, but there are areas that can get shaped differently by the society around them. And that was something that I think for Paulette particularly, she's very interested in. So I don't know if you want to add any more to the background, Paulette.
No, Penny, I think you've captured it there, because a lot of times when we hear about abuse, we focus on male abuse, and particularly as it relates to sexual abuse, there is the notion that it's the male, and what happens with women who are seen as nurturers and carers, and that is underreported, and I don't think we have an accurate set of data anywhere. The literature also indicates that there is a paucity of data as it relates to female sexual abuse. And so this is what makes this whole study more interesting, because we were talking to a male who reported his experience, and he too, and as we get into further into the data, you'll see that he was given credits, he was given accolades for his relationship with a female, even though that started at a very young age of 13. And then we also looked at the type of women that he got involved with, and that also adds to the whole body of knowledge that we were able to develop. What was also interesting, Penny, is when you started to talk about the impact of slavery and history, because in this instance, we also looked at a Black male And the literature also speaks to the underreporting of sexual violence against Black boys and Black men, right? So let's continue, please.
Yes, yes. So just a little bit about the study. So we kind of, so again, we'll come back to this, why, and this was a little bit of the debate, because again, it's good to explore as well in this setting when you're co-writing or collaborating, how things change. And, you know, we had many healthy debates, didn't we, Paulette? And this paper took us, you know, almost a year and a bit to formulate, because each time we looked at it, some other new idea or thought or critique came about it. So for us, it was a really good learning experience about writing collaboratively, writing over the internet, and but also kind of redefining this, because when the first iteration of this paper, it was very much focused on female sexual abuse. But as we started to look at this, and some of the nuances that we needed to take care of is things like you know, in Guyana at this at the time of the case, talking about his life, is age of consent for males in Guyana. I don't know if anyone would like to guess what that would be. You know, shout out in the crowd. No, no one is going to shout out. It was 13, which was surprising. So we had to kind of, and part of that was saying, well, how do you define sexual, you know, if someone cannot consent, or they are at the age where they are consenting, is that, so we had this big debate. So again, that is again another area to debate, but we decided, because there was enough literature to talk about sexual exploitative relationships in early male adolescence. So we wanted to focus on that, because we felt, again, this is something that is part of Guyanese society. So again, we had to say, well, this it may seem as if this is not harmful because there is a consent, but we're talking about early adolescence, someone who is still emotionally growing, so, and forming their identity, at the same time getting into relationships that we felt were more exploitative. So we kind of reframed it in that way. But for us, it is still a form of sexual abuse, because as an adult coercing a younger person in a relationship that is in a way is more controlled. So the power dynamics, you know, fit the dynamics of what we would define as abuse. So again, because, you know, you can have those arguments. And we thought, because of this, we wanted to look at masculinity and use a performative masculinity perspective about what shapes those performative acts of how you become a male and your male identity. And so after reading through the story, this is the idea we wanted to take. And if Paulette has anything to add.
Keep moving forward.
And why this narrative, why was important? So again, as you said, we wanted to understand the long-term consequences of this kind of relationship, and particularly on, you know, when you've got a young adolescent male. And these were our questions.
So we wanted to find out in what ways can this form of abuse lead a man in later life to attempt his own life, to take his own life. Which factors would drive him to attempt to take his own life and contemplate taking the life of his partner. And then we also wanted to find out in what ways does this form of abuse shape ideals surrounding masculinity, the masculine identity, and the performative acts of masculinity.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll come. So what we did, we used a therapeutic narrative approach, and partly because the case approached Paulette and wanted to tell his story. And that was very important. And again, it was picking up what Prudence was saying at the beginning of while we were chatting and waiting for people. I don't know if some people heard our initial conversations, where we're, you know, this people wanting to tell their stories. And if you sit and you listen long enough, they tell you stories. They tell you, they try to make sense of what's happened. So we took this approach. Now, we didn't use, it wasn't a therapeutic session in as such, other than he wanted to reflect and he wanted to be able to tell his story. So there was a bit of guidance in terms of asking questions and drawing out various things, which actually is part of that therapeutic narrative approach in terms of saying, well, what happened? Tell us your story. And as the story unfolds, people start to make connections or start to recount things that we hope to make sense with them about it. So that's what we did. And then we use this performative masculinity lens to explore the narrative and sort of give us a construct as to try and work out how these an alternative way to explore, interpret how these experiences shaped his masculine identity. And what's important with this case is you know, where he starts, where he's from, what has happened. He was hospitalized after an attempt to take his own life, and then he then had his period of hospitalization. He then self-reported that he had contemplated killing his partner. But as the story went on, he started to
just before you go there, Penny,
yes,
I just wanted to jump in here and talk about another paper that I had done in terms of access to chemicals and access and how easy it was to access things, because largely in our context, like now you're getting people using other forms, but it was a period, it was primarily agrochemicals that was used in the act of committing suicide or the attempts to commit suicide. And this young man told us a story where he walked in after he got so depressed, so dissatisfied, so disillusioned. He walked into a store in his hometown that sold the chemicals, and he actually did not have enough money to procure the chemical, but yet they gave it to him. And he mixed it, he told us how he mixed it with the Guinness, and then he drank it and he walked around the park. So whilst he wanted to hurt himself, he was also, he eventually walked from that park to a relative's place of work. And there is where he collapsed. So it would seem that he was crying out for help along the way, and he were missing people who were close to him. And those are the things that we also have to try to evaluate. What is it? And when he was hospitalized, was there anyone who was able to take his story and to find out what his pain was? Because I do know at the healthcare facility, when someone attempts, they receive some measure of counseling. What I don't know is what form that counseling takes and how in-depth it is. Because after talking to him, all I got from him is that they talked to me, right? So I just thought that as we are having this conversation, it's important too, and that's the area for another study possibly. Good? Right? But he, in telling his story, I don't think he was satisfied. And that is why he wanted to to talk more about his experiences and all the things that led up to his experiences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's important also to say that we're taking, we're presenting this, looking at it from a different lens, and that different other lenses and other approaches could be used to come up with other explanations. But we thought this was a way of offering a different explanation to the norm that's usually used. So this is what we did. We looked at Pitt and Fox put together what they call the performative performative masculinity conceptual kind of framework, and they blended it with a little bit of Bourdieu around habitus and what creates a habitus, and then through that the nature of a habitus, basically, your where you are, what shapes you, your culture, your norms, your society, or the power dynamics, your relationships. These all create what you call your field, and within your field is your habitus. So that's in a nutshell. So they looked at this in terms of saying, well, how your environment, your community, your society reinforces or shapes the kind of acts that you take, kind of starts to put you into these forms of masculinity. Now, if you're drawing on Connell's work and Baxter's work, Butler's work, they see masculinity as a continuum. You can go from being is heterodoxy to orthodoxy. Those are the two that you kind of move to and from, which is a kind of traditional constructs of what masculinity would be, that will be shaped by what you see and how what's reinforced all the time. And then that's the reenactment ones and the remaking, the constant changing as you adapt to life as you grow up. And then what they did talk about as well is about this, what happens when there's a crisis within a masculinity sort of framework around how do people then deal with it. And they looked at this mainly from what we call queer studies, where they were looking at when people realize at some point in time that they're changing their sexuality. But I thought that this was a good way of exploring this within the context of sexual abuse or exploitation, around what happens when through the acts that have developed you over time, there's a change. And then what do you do when this change happens, and how does that affect your performance? And those acts that you had developed over time start to change. And this is what we kind of looked at. So when he tells his story, you start to, these were the kind of things that started to come up for us. He was very confident, he was stoic, he was very independent. As time went on, the traditional masculine traits or acts that you want to call it, were, as he was growing up, was reinforced through his, his ability to be sexually active from a very young age, and brings with it status. And he was a big chap, as he explained. He was well built, and throughout his story, it was shaped by his ability to attract very high-powered women, and he gained rewards, financial, security, and in his story he talks about being able to have a nice place to sleep and having food, but also being able to support his family. And I'll talk a little more about that. But so these were kind of, as we started to build over time, it shaped into being more self-reliant, sexually virile, stoic again, independent, emotionally strong. And I put educated in the middle, and I'll come back to that, because actually what I should have done is put the broken lines there, because actually what we had was what I've kind of called the failed remaking, or what we've decided was the failed remaking that led to this aggressive kind of thoughts about harming himself and harming others. Because this for me, and we got different interpretations about this, but I started to pick up on this as he brought it up again and again about not being educated. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But just going back to this idea of performance and performative roles and acts and how that shapes masculinity, we looked at this family relationships, and this was something that, isn't that right, Paula, that came up again and again, how you kind of prompted and said, oh, did your family know? And he didn't say yes or no, but it became clear as he tells the story, yes, they did know, but at that time they didn't think it was a problem. He's 13 years old, he's a big boy, and this brings in some of in the paper that we talk around the whole thing of Paulette will elaborate around black males and being seen as sexually active early is a sign of manhood, and some authors are kind of exploring this in the context of past colonial Western thoughts of masculinity that have been created, that have been imposed upon Black males through time, and the effects that could have. And that's, I think, is a paper by Wallace that has been exploring that as well. And I know that Paulette has been looking at some of these papers. But what we could see, if we're looking at this from a masculinity performance perspective, is that every time he did an act, it was reinforced. It was reinforced with being able to bring money, being reinforced of being a provider and a protector, which then fits into those kind of masculinity roles around being, the traditional being masculine acts with the sort of remaking each time as he goes through time. Anything to add, Paulette, or shall I go on?
Yes, I think basically what we got from him is that his peers, the younger ones in his family, seemed to know and to accept the benefits to be derived from his income that he generated as a young man, as a young provider. And the older members of his family, they saw this woman as taking care of him, a mothering figure, as against someone who he was engaged with in a relationship, right? So we saw that definitely coming out through the papers, and amongst his brothers and his friends and so on, he gained status because of what he was able to do. He gained acceptance as, having a big woman, and that kind of acknowledgement of his masculinity. So his masculinity was defined from a very early age as to what he could do. But Penny, as you correctly said in the earlier slide, we have to come back to the impact of education on all of this, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So we'll come back to that. We'll come to that because you'll see how this is all kind of works together in my crazy diagrams where I try to make sense of data. But so again, just picking up, there was this silence. So the social norms, and this was something that we talked about. And again, one of the things that we will need to do, because we can't find any literature this in a Guyanese context, because I don't know, and maybe Paulette knows if anyone's written about this, and then maybe this is an area that someone would like to explore again, about the silent acceptance of sexual relationships in the community, even though they may be seen as not quite right. But as Paulette pointed out, if they bring benefits to the wider society, and this is where this kind of habitus idea, the power dynamics bring some benefits to the wider society, and kind of ignoring maybe some of the detrimental effects on the person, it is acceptable. So again, these are some of the things that we need to explore, because it became a mark, or as Paulette said, a mark of manhood. A big man who can attract big women who are professional, and these are very powerful sort of stories to have, and to support your status within a community. And
One of the things that emerged in a piece of study that was done just last year by ChildLink is that there's an increasing abuse of boys. The abuse of boys is largely underreported, but there's an increasing number of reports on boys and following through to the actions. But then the systemic structures, it's the silence on the abuse of boys and the norms in terms of what boys should talk and what and tell, and whether boys should tell or not. So there is an evolving body of knowledge on around the social norms and the sexual abuse of boys.
So, and that comes up to status. So one of the, the themes, you got one theme we came up with, and I think this is, this is areas for us to develop more. And I think the idea is that we can gather some more stories. I know that my PhD student, Io, is here, and I know she's gathered a lot of data for her studies and her ethnographic field study from focus groups. And again, I think that'll be a rich source of data for us to examine as well, some of these stories, because I think a lot of the focus group turned out to be a lot of storytelling, which I think is really important. So again, I think we can build on this. This was, this is the beginning with one case. But what we started to look at was this this idea of the orthodoxy, but then the cacoxy, where we talk about, what happened, what was this crisis? A crisis happened, and what we can interpret, and this is an interpretation of where the point of crisis was this his repeated view that he wasn't educated, and he wanted to be educated. And this came through in the story when he was talking about his relationship with his wife, who he, as far as he was concerned, he supported her to be educated. But when it came to his turn, he felt this support was not given. And trying to unpick the story, but he felt that this was a form of betrayal. And then he became very aggressive towards her and distrustful, and their relationship broke down. But one of the things to me that really highlighted that this may have been an issue for him around changing his state, his masculinity state, or his status from being a dominant male, which he was through his sexual prowess and the fact that he had a good business and it was very much manual, to suddenly realizing that he wanted to be an educated man. And because of what happened during his childhood, and his early adolescent years, in his story, he tells about the inability to finish school because he was too tired, and that, the women were very controlling and didn't allow him to carry on with school, or it didn't allow him to carry on with school because he had to be there looking after the women. He was tired from his evenings, exploits and so on, or, whatever he was asked to do, but which meant that he lost out. Yes.
Yes, and the demands that it placed on him, because it was not only school, but it was the relationship with his peers. He was not allowed to have relationships with girls and boys his own age. If he did not get home by a certain time, in the first instance, when he was pretty young, 13, his partner, this woman who was the sexual, sorry for saying his partner, but the woman who was abusing him came to his school and collected him. And he had made a good secondary school, but because his parents saw him helping that family, because that's how it started. He went over as a mini man to take care, to be the protector of that home after her husband migrated. And in Ghana, there was a whole period and season of migration and women being left alone. And he fell into that role of protector. So he was deprived of completing his education early. he was deprived of relationships, that informal education with his peers. So he suffered several layers of deprivation. And all of those affected him. And he has been consistent in the relationships that he formed. Because up to the writing of this paper, he has said that he doesn't see himself with younger women. He has never engaged in friendships and relationships with younger women. He's always seen himself with older women because that was his socialization.
So which brings us back to using a performative lens, because it allows us to explore some of these relationships and these acts and how they get reinforced, and how certain behaviors and acts and performances are kind of reinforced and what happens over time. But then using this framework, it allows us to also explore what happens when these things break, when you have a crisis. So he has a crisis in terms of his identity. He wanted to change his identity, but what we found is that he didn't have those performative acts that is associated with being educated. That whole thing, that habitats, that, you know, so sets of experiences that you need, that you go through school and you do with learning, and you create those kind of formative relationships that you do with your peers. So he's got to a stage where this was becoming difficult for him and his own identity. And I think for me was in the story when he says that, you know, I think for him this almost a layer of shame, and we haven't explored that, not being able to help his children with their homework. And I think that was, you know, like almost a final straw, a final reminder that, you know, this is, you know, what use am I? And a sense of hopelessness. So again, it just gave us this approach, gave us the ability to explore other aspects of people's lives. What shapes them, the acts and the performances that shape how we are, what is around us, and then how do we deal with this at a later stage in life. So this was our offering. And again, we you know, it's not enough to generalize, and I was saying, but you know, we're hoping to build on this and get more data to start to use this framework, and maybe gather some more, you know, develop the construct that we've got built on pit and foxes. But you know, thinking about, you know, the impact of abuse. And even though we're seeing, and particularly in the Guyanese context and in other contexts, where Black males in particular, you know, is this something that we have to be aware of? The impact of what I call early sexualization, this early sort of sexual exploitation of young men. And we should see it as a form of abuse, so that we actually give it the attention that it needs. And this idea of normative traditional practices, you know, what is normalized within what I would call a society, and how we should start to unpick that and make it not such a normal aspect of life, because over time we can see that there is an impact on how someone sees their sense of self. Paulette.
Yes. I agree. I think what this entire experience helped us to understand through the eyes of this case was the importance of trust in a relationship. And that male or female trust. And when those normative acts are broken, in terms of the whole performative aspect of it all too, what we also found is, as Penny highlighted, he wanted education to perform in a certain way. He wanted education to help his children. He wanted education to advance his business. And because he had been moving with women who had that kind of formal education, and his education was largely informal, because he was successful in his business. He was successful as a performer, but he wanted the completeness, and he felt that he was denied that. A major challenge that we found, and this presentation does not bring out all of what we found within the study, was how he continued to relate with women. What are those barriers to his relationships? What the trust broke down eventually when he could not see he only had access to his children through the court, even though he was maintaining them, providing, and all those other things. And what were those push factors that led him to want to take his own life and want to harm someone else, right? And we found that there were a multitude, there was no single factor that contributed to this. There was a whole multiplicity of issues, and you can trace them at that line from childhood to adulthood, and all the periods along the way that affected him in terms of how he performed, of how he was perceived, and what he did. You know, because at the end of it, he did not, even though he wanted to harm himself and he wanted to harm her, he did not want to hurt his children. And it was his children that saved her.
So if we come to the end of our presentation, there's some references. Just to say that our paper is under review, so we're hoping for a favorable reviewer comments and put it into publication. So are there any questions, comments, views? You know, happy if anyone puts it in a chat or would like to ask us via, you know, the usual methods of voice.
Thank you for hearing us.
Yes, thank you very much. Any questions?
There's one in the chat, Penny.
Okay.
Yes.
Variations in the outcomes associated with differences. So no, because I wouldn't be able to talk about that because we weren't really looking at variations in that way. I don't know. This is a single case study that was pretty much looking at someone else's story. Now, I suppose socioeconomic status is an interesting question, because as we can trace his story, he came from, I would say, a low income household, but he became a high income person. So again, what we could interpret from his story was that economic status was not wasn't an issue. Now, I am Guyanese, and I can tell you one thing which is really funny, that you know, I know that when my mother goes to her various dances in her you know, the Guyanese communities in other parts of the way, when I told her I was going to do a PhD, she was absolutely, that was the best thing she could take back to the next social gathering with her peers. And even though some of her peers had the children and their family members who were millionaires and had made it financially, for her, the biggest thing in the community, in that group, in a particular group, is that education. And I remember growing up and being educated, having a PhD, going to various universities was a huge status, but more than actually being economically successful. And I don't know if things have changed now, but if you think of that generation, of those generations that are coming through now in my age group, when we were growing up, being an educated person and going to university had a higher status than actual income. And I don't know if that is still today, Paulette. You know, I remember a whole village will pay and support someone to go and be educated. And I know
Yes.
that when I worked at the university with Father Rodriguez.
That was a traditionally, and I think we still have lots of supportive communities. And I don't know how much, but I know there's a high premium on education.
Yes.
Right? There's another question in the chat in terms of how long the relationship started, lasted, and I can't remember the other part of it, right?
And how did it actually begin, and why him?
Yes, and in this instance, this was a relationship with a neighbor, a family member, well, what you call aunties in your communities, that was respected. And this young man was chosen because of his size, his build, his structure, right? And he felt proud to be so chosen because, you know, he met the criteria of a mini man, and I can protect. And that is what he was there for, you know? So that first relationship, I think it was about 3 years or thereabouts, or 3 or 4 years or thereabouts. But it went for a while because, and he had access to the home, that's where he was staying. He was the protector of the home of this woman. And we have one element where he told us she fed me ice cream. And he recounted that whole experience when she came home one evening, brought this ice cream, and how he was seduced, how he was, you know, how he was, what's the correct word that we use, Penny?
Well, they call it grooming. It's a current. Well, I suppose they were in. He was by that time. He was part of the. You know, he was being, you know, exploited,
and definitely was exploited.
Yes.
Right. And it ended when she migrated to the U.S.
And then he found another lady, didn't he?
Yes. Yes, he did. And again, this other woman that he ended with was a husband who worked out of the community. So again, he was providing that protector role and fell into another role. Right.
And they were high status women in the community. So again, this was something else as well. That was an interesting, you know, when he talks about it, this is his perception. So we can go, and again, what we have to be aware of when you're using constructs and we're using people's narratives is there is an element of their perceptions, which is very important, because these are the things that shape how people have their mental cognitive maps and how they're shaped, and the relationships and the nature of those relationships. And I think this is one of the things that we felt it had to be very careful about, is acknowledging, recognizing, and making sure that, you know, we're true to his experiences, because they're his and they have shaped how he is. So I think we approach this very much non-judgmental on his part, because he's recounting and trying to make the sense of it for himself. And our role is to guide that process. So that was one element. And the second element was putting a lens to it to try and to kind of make sense of it for him, with him.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the therapeutic part came with him telling us that story. You know, he got a chance to recount all of it in one space.
I don't think he did. I'm curious about his view of his own family, especially his mom. I think from what we can tell in the story, that I think this is within the what I call the social norms at the time. I don't think it. I mean, I'm trying to recall about growing up in that era, and you know, these are the kind of things that is the reality of life. I don't know if it would have, and he never spoke about the nature of his relationship with his family in any detail. So we couldn't, I mean, that could be something we could revisit, but that wasn't really what he wanted to talk about.
He more
So I
spoke
think,
about his brothers, you know, and them knowing, but him not speaking, because it was a bond of secrecy. The relationship, that was part of the relationship, that bond of secrecy, so that he maintains his standard of living, his relationship, the benefits he thought he derived, you know. And also part of the manhood, because real men don't talk, real men don't tell, so you don't go about talking and telling. So from a very early age, he was socialized, further socialized into holding those secrets.
Was he the oldest of the brothers?
No, he was not, but he was the
biggest.
Biggest.
So yes. So yeah, it's interesting, and how we came about this was interesting, and what was really lovely is that we took time to think. And I think the important message, for people coming up and wanting to get involved in this kind of research and this kind of methodology is, it does take time and thinking through, and the analysis of the data and the co-writing. We eventually got there, but it takes another thought, stepping back, coming back to it, creating diagrams, typologies, exploring the data again, going back to the story, and then coming up with what we felt it was a true, a true recounting, not true recounting, a kind of trying to give a perspective that could be useful. And also trying to open up a different lens to exploring suicide ideation. And sometimes it's those small little events that build up over time. As you were saying, that there are a lot of suicides that people take their own life who've never been to services. What was building up during over time? I'm not sure from a intervention point of view what we could offer now, but again, I think this is something to build up over time and start to explore with providers or people who are wanting to build programs. What should it look like? And I think this is what Paulette will be more exploring around social work. What that is there something to think about what's going on in the society? But cultural norms, as we know, it's difficult to change. Now, I don't know if some of these kind of social, traditional thinking and behaviors that were existing then when he was a young man still persist in society. And that might be another set of questions to ask, are these still going on? Yes, as I was sort of answering your question about how do you think we can forward in encouraging this aspect of expression of males in Guyana, especially with the protective masculinity norms. I think one of the things is, I suppose, is creating those environments where, which I don't know if that it is possible, because we'd have to create environments where we're suggesting that all performative acts that are associated with masculinity are not harmful. But I'm really not sure at the moment, realistically, how we could create those societies where those kind of reinforcement situations, what I call the habitats in the fields, the agents, how they all interact together, make sure that we end up with forms of masculinity that allow people to move freely between one aspect to the next, working in harmony with the females in the community. or those, because we got to be aware of the changing thoughts, conceptualization of gender, genderization, sexuality that is happening in other parts of the world, and at some point will be part of Guyanese thinking. Again, how do we embrace these changes in gender expression and sexuality within a community such as Guyana? I don't know if any more questions, sorry. Okay, well, please comment.
I have to say, as a moderator, I found this fascinating.
Thank you. Well, spread the good news. Tell everyone how marvelous we are.
No, I mean, I think that often people don't think about social roles and what shapes a person, but instead a lot of the suicide research is focused on diagnosis.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
Diagnosis is just a classification system, and it's only part of what you should be looking at. I mean, there are a lot of other factors that go into what's going on with people, and it's not always captured. It's usually not captured by just looking at, oh, he has this diagnosis. So it's very interesting.
We have something from Razia Khan, is that right? I have a comment. Can I? Whoever would like to, would you like to make a comment?
Hi, good morning.
Oh, they still there. I could see it in the chat. Hi, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Raisa Khan. I'm a counseling psychologist here in Guyana. I'm currently committing a crime by texting and driving, but I wanted to stay on the call. Just from a Guyanese psychological perspective, what I've noticed, not so much in males, though I have many male clients, and I actually am one of the few psychologists that works with LGBTQ persons here in Guyana. So I do work with males, and I do work with males who've experienced what would be deemed inappropriate sexual experiences at a young age. What I've realized in Guyana is that we do have to take into consideration culture, and that could be a whole other discussion. But one of the theories or one of the themes I've noticed through working with trauma and sexual trauma in Guyana is the concept of, because of the grooming that transpires between the hot and cold, between the, if you do this act or if you are complacent with this act, these are the benefits that you get. And because we're building this condition between what I'm saying for you to do, whether it's touching me, looking at porn, whatever the case may be, engaging in an inappropriate act, but then you get attention and love and affection and monetary things and so on. And so because that is conditioned between this act equates, there's a benefit. In human nature, we move towards things that benefit us and move away from things that don't benefit us. And because what I've realized is, especially my female clients, they recognize their body as a form of payment. And so we then have this condition of, if I would like to feel, in this case, this young man wanted a safe space, a roof over his head, food, and especially because he doesn't speak about his mother, there is an assumption, we can make an assumption that there is also a need for an older maternal bond as well, hence why he keeps replicating the case of returning to older women, because that is an unfulfilled or unmet emotional need being met. And he has realized that his payment is his protectiveness, his payment is as a confidant, his payment is sex, right? His body. And so that is something, I apologize, I did not hear the whole discussion. I probably got the last 40 minutes. But so maybe you did go into body as a payment, but that is something, especially in the Guyanese context, whereby because we have so many people who've experienced what I deem inappropriate sexual experiences at a young age, whether they're 5, 10, 15, 20, it's a common theme that we have to look at how those interactions, those experiences form people's core beliefs about themselves. I recognize that many persons who do attempt to self-harm or complete suicide are persons who tend to not have a sense of purpose or a sense of identity or a sense of my only job. Like, for example, this young man, one of his thoughts, though obviously not true, may have been, my only purpose is to have sex with this big woman. That's my purpose in life. This is what I've been brought to. I don't get to be the father I want to be. I am restricted by the courts or whatever the case may be. This is all I can do. And when those things don't really work out, or if you find a partner who wants more from you than just being a protector or a sexual partner, it kind of crashes the concept of self. I've been made to believe that I am just good for being a physical protector and a sexual partner. But hey, here now is a woman who doesn't care for these things. She wants someone who's more emotive. She wants someone that is more capable of doing something that I cannot, or engage in discussions that I cannot because maybe I'm not at that educational level.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to dash off to another meeting. But what I was going to say, that if people are interested in finding out more or want to expand or think about this in other ways, because I think you raised some really interesting points that, would merit some, some further exploration. No, we didn't look at body payments because we were looking at from very much a Bourdieu kind of lens around the shaping of, how a habitus, how your cultural norms and your feels, where you live, how you live, the wider societal impact shapes the way you act and then what those acts do. So, and I can see someone talking about, that they're, looking at what's happening in indigenous populations and so on. So I'm gathering from the comments and from our presentation that it has generated some discussion. It's generated, people starting to look at it differently, which is really what, we were intending. And, I'm really, both of us would be really happy if people would want to talk to us more about this and maybe suggest how, if there's any room for taking this forward with additional sets of data or interests. I hope that is all right, but I'm going to have to dash in about a minute. So if there's any closing comments, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Prudence, for being our moderator. Please get in touch if you want to find out more from us. And if you want to carry on the conversation, that'd be marvelous.
I actually have to go too.
Okay.
Say thank you for a really, really interesting presentation. Thanks to both of you. It's fascinating. I never realized that the population was so small, though.
Yeah.
Yep, we're tiny little place.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're smaller than Iceland. I think your population is about the same.
We're about the same size of Lincolnshire in England.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop here, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Paulette, for sharing this with me and allowing me to take part in your wonderful story.
Thank you, Penny.
You're welcome.
It's good to work with you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.